An ancient battlefield in Montana. According to legend, one of the greatest acts of American military bravery took place here when in 1876, George Armstrong Custer made his heroic last stand against a Native American settlement. And yet, because no soldiers survived, the truth remains unclear. Over a century later, archaeologists are unraveling the secrets of Custer's last stand. Was it one of the bravest episodes in US military history? Or one of history's greatest myths? (1876), a decade after the American Civil War. The nation was making its great expansion west. To clear the way, Native American tribes of the Great Plains were sent to reservations far from their homes. But one group held firm. George Armstrong Custer was ordered to end their resistance. On the 25th of June, Custer led the nation's foremost frontier fighters, the 7th Cavalry, into a Native American camp along the Little Bighorn River in southeastern Montana. Until now, all we have known for certain is that every one of Custer's men was killed.
The country was stunned. Custer, the hero of the Civil War, Custer and his whole regiment, the 7th Cavalry, the best Indian fighting regiment in the West, have been wiped out by essentially Stone Age people. Here we were a modern industrial nation, and this unbelievable anachronism occurred in the West.
Of 220 soldiers who took part in the battle, not a single one survived. Hundreds of books and over 50 feature films speculate what might have happened. How outnumbered soldiers valiantly resisted, stubbornly fighting to the last bullet. How Custer and his men died in a brave and noble last stand against the Indians.
Custer was America's golden warrior, and now he was our martyr on the altar of manifest destiny. The myth of Custer's last stand, that gallant defense against a savage foe in the Western Plains, swept the nation.
No one knew if the legend of the last stand was true until a fire cleared the way for a forensic investigation. In August 1983, a brush fire raced through central Montana, burning many kilometers of grass and ground cover. For the first time in years, the Little Bighorn battlefield was exposed. Archaeologist Rich Fox recognized the chance of a lifetime.
Just several days after the range fire, I walked this whole area and looked like a moonscape. The vegetation hadn't been affected for decades and decades and decades, and it was just a thick carpet. You couldn't see the ground. But after the fire, no problem. I found bullets and cartridge cases and bones.
Fox joined forces with Doug Scott, an archaeologist specializing in historic battlefields.
We treated every artifact we found as if it was a piece of physical evidence that might be found in a crime scene. Every piece was a clue.
The battlefield was divided into grids. Over 600 acres was scoured with metal detectors.
We had no way of knowing what to expect on the very first day. But all of a sudden, the metal detector started singing. You couldn't believe it. It was one after another, beep, 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 beep. People were so excited.
We have a 4570 bullet. The direction is south.
The archaeologists recovered and mapped over 5,000 artifacts.
I've got it. That's 8162.
They found a soldier's Swiss-made pocket watch and a gold wedding ring still on a finger. Spent and unfired cartridges. A foot still inside its boot. A skull shattered by a blast from behind. Evidence of an execution.
We don't change history. Custer died, but we see a richer depth to that story. We can see the personal level of hand-to-hand combat, the marks on the soldiers' remains, the cartridge cases, the bullets. They tell us where people fought, where those guns were used.
Over the next 10 years, the archaeologists worked as though they were detectives combing the battlefield. Using the techniques of forensic science, they were trying to reconstruct the battle step by step. They were determined to solve one of history's greatest mysteries. Was Custer's famous last stand a protracted, heroic battle, or a short, devastating defeat? In the mid-1800s, America had been divided by a bloody civil war. Northern states, led by President Abraham Lincoln, were fighting their own countrymen from states to the south. George Armstrong Custer joined the battle in 1861 as a member of the Northern Union Army. Once a lackluster soldier from America's elite military academy, West Point, Custer quickly gained notoriety in the cavalry.
Custer, as a commander, was one of those rare individuals who would go into battle, not behind his men, but in front, leading the charge. Custer had a dozen horses shot out from under him.
Reckless? Sure. But that, of course, is a standard requirement of a cavalryman. Brave, unbelievably so. In fact, he's one of those individuals who simply did not know fear at all.
At the age of just 23, Custer was made Brigadier General, the youngest man in US history ever to attain the rank. Soon after, at Gettysburg, the deadliest battle of the Civil War, the Northern Union Army suffered more than 20,000 casualties. Custer survived and became a hero when he repelled a major charge from Southern Confederate soldiers.
From then on, of course, his career just took off like a meteor, blazing across the firmament. Custer was the darling of the Northern press, and they reported his wild charges with relish.
In 1865, the American Civil War ended. The government reduced the size of its army, and Custer's position became redundant. But the former general decided to accept a lower rank as a mere lieutenant colonel. Over the next decade, Custer searched for opportunities to regain his early glory. As the Civil War ended, the gold rush began in the American West. During that time, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Mostly Indian sacred land, the Black Hills ranged through Wyoming and Dakota Territory in the far west. Thousands of prospectors invaded the territories, and the US acted to protect the settlers from Indian retaliation. They forced the Indian tribes onto reservations far from their homes and sacred land. But a group of mainly Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne resisted. They were gathered to the north of the Black Hills by Montana's Little Bighorn River. Amongst them was the legendary Sitting Bull. The group had no intention of moving.
The orders came from the government for these tribes to report to their reservations and quit roaming around. And Sitting Bull said, not me. I'd rather die fighting out here than to die like a dog in a reservation.
On the 17th of May, 1876, George Custer and his 7th Cavalry rode out from Fort Lincoln, North Dakota, to bring the last holdouts to the reservations. Archaeologists have spent nearly 20 years excavating the site of Custer's last stand. One of their first questions was to establish more about the men who fought with Custer. The 7th Cavalry was regarded as the nation's elite fighting force. After the Civil War, the cavalry was used primarily to control the Indians. Remarkably, little is known about most of these soldiers. But the skulls, leg bones, and hand bones discovered provided vital clues. These bones were sent to the laboratory of forensic anthropologist P. Willey. Willey often conducts postmortems for police investigating recent murders. His task was to construct the first forensic portrait of Custer's men at the last stand. He began by establishing their height.
What we're doing is measuring the bones to estimate the stature of the troopers. Do that by getting the maximum length and then plugging that into a formula.
The length of a femur helped to indicate the soldier's height.
This femur was from a person who was about 5'6", which is in the range that we'd expect for the troopers.
After extensive research, P. Willey concluded that the average soldier was 1.5 meters tall. To reduce the strain on the horses, the cavalry rarely accepted anyone weighing over 70 kilos or standing greater than 2 meters. Custer was much taller than the average soldier. Many of the soldiers had missing teeth, the mark of poor dental hygiene, and eating years-old Civil War-era rations. Long hours in the saddle also left a lasting mark on the soldier's vertebrae.
As you can see here, there's a depression that indicates that his spine was deteriorating, degenerating. The reason that they had these depressions is because they were riding months and months on tough saddles. Must have been extremely painful.
As Willey began to estimate the age of the soldiers, the results were surprising.
The minimum age for enlistment was 21, but the skeletons indicated that there were a number of troopers who were younger than 21, in some cases years younger than 21.
The investigators had a new image of the fighters of the last stand. These men were known as the nation's elite soldiers, but in fact, the scientists discovered they were as young as 17, malnourished, and perhaps in chronic pain. June 1876. Custer and his men embarked on a 40-day journey towards the Little Bighorn River. His command included 31 officers and 566 enlisted men. He was also accompanied by 35 Indian scouts. The scouts were mostly Crow and Arikara, traditional enemies of the Sioux and Cheyenne. Custer pushed his men hard, eager to reach the Little Bighorn quickly.
A lot of people were nervous about Custer's attitude. He refused Gatling guns, he refused additional troops of cavalry. He was determined it was to be a victory only for the 7th.
At daybreak on the 25th of June, Custer's men reached a high knoll above the river. Barely visible in the distance, his Crow scouts sighted a huge Indian encampment. Among the scouts was Joe Medicine Crow's grandfather.
Custer jumped off his horse, took his field glasses and looked around, shook his head, said, "I can't see it." And the scouts said, "They're there." With their own naked eyes, they could see.
Unapparent to Custer, there were more than 7,000 Sioux and Cheyenne, including the famed warrior Sitting Bull. It was one of the greatest native gatherings ever assembled on the plains. According to legend, leader of the scouts, the half-Sioux, half-French Mitch Boyer, made a dire prediction, telling Custer, "Neither one of us will live." Custer decided to attack. He divided his troops into 3 groups. Major Reno, with 130 men, would charge into the southern end of the Indian camp. Custer, with 220 men, would strike from the north. And Captain Benteen, with 125 men, was to block an escape route. From a higher position, Custer could see that he was outnumbered by his enemy. But retreat was not in his nature.
Custer had taken off his hat and yelled to his men, "Hurrah, boys, we've caught them napping. We'll finish this up and go home to our station." So whatever he saw, he was not afraid of what was down there.
Custer had sent a note to Captain Benteen, who was several kilometers away. He ordered him to return with his 125 men. But Custer didn't wait for the reinforcements to arrive. He charged towards the river and the Indian village. As Custer headed into battle, what kind of firepower did he face? And what arms did he have to defend himself with? More than a century later, archaeologists searched for clues to the weapons the Indians carried. They found over 1,000 spent cartridges. Many came from the 7th Cavalry's primary gun, the Springfield carbine.
This is one of the weapons carried by Custer's troopers at this battle. It's the model 1873 Springfield carbine. It was single shot, loaded with 1 cartridge at a time, and fired.
No gun was superior to the Springfield in distance, accuracy, or stopping power. They also found bullets from the cavalry's primary sidearm, the Colt 45, the most reliable gun of its time.
It held 6 cartridges, used for close-in fighting.
Then, a real find for the investigators. Non-government bullets and cartridges, the ammunition of the Indians. The battlefield detectives conducted a ballistic analysis to determine what weapons the warriors were carrying. They began by stripping the cartridges of a century of grime. The cartridges were then sent to the Nebraska State Police Laboratory for analysis.
What we have are two long marks that are typical of the Henry rifle.
The marks were firing pin impressions. Each model rifle left a different mark.
Now let's look at this one. This is a single firing pin imprint and it's wide and blocky.
The imprint came from the Colt Open Top 1872. Archaeologists also found the Sharps carbine and the Spencer carbine. In total, they identified over 47 types of guns. The Indians were much better armed than anyone ever suspected. At least 200 of the warriors had multiple shot weapons.
This is one of the repeating rifles used by the warriors here at the Kastër battlefield. It's known as the Henry repeating rifle. One of the features was the way that you had to load it. Held 16 shots through this open magazine tube.
The soldiers' single-shot carbines were more accurate and had twice the range than the Indians' weapons. But close in, a warrior with a repeater could fire as many as 16 shots before a soldier could even reload. Cartridge cases would reveal the size of the battle. But at the riverbank, there are few remnants of a fight.
Our archaeological work found hardly anything related to the battle. A couple of bullets and a couple of cartridge cases. This is certainly contrary to the heroic legend that Custer's battalion was met at the ford here and driven by hordes of Indians to the killing fields. But the archaeology says no.
But Fox didn't just rely on archaeology. His findings were backed by long-ignored Indian eyewitness testimony recorded by Western anthropologists. These claimed that there was no great battle at the river.
Here's an account by Hedog, a Lakota Sioux. There was no fighting while Custer down near river. 15 or 20 Sioux on east side of river, and some of soldiers replied, but not much shooting there.
So, what did happen at the river? Fox believes that Custer took half his men down to the river, but found the village nearly empty. The Indian warriors had traveled in one direction to fight Major Reno. Meanwhile, the women and children had fled to safety in the other direction. Custer headed back up the ridge and made a choice. He chased the women and children.
Custer's objective was to return the Indians to the Great Sioux Reservation. Capture the women and children, you render the warriors impotent, and you can take care of the village later.
Custer seemed intent on taking hostages. Making a second trip to the river, he eventually approached the women and children. However, when he discovered there were too many for him to transport, he abandoned this tactic. He left the river without any hostages. The legend of the Last Stand begins with Custer charging to the river to attack the huge Indian village at the Little Bighorn. Here, Custer met an overwhelming onslaught. the Indians drove his troops back up the slopes. Hopelessly outnumbered, the soldiers stubbornly fought to the last. Archaeological detectives have examined the legend of the last stand, step by step. So, what happened at the Little Bighorn? Was Custer attacked by a vast Indian army and placed on the defensive from the very start? To determine Custer's next move, the archaeologists searched the ridge above the river. They discovered hundreds of battlefield artifacts, buckles, horseshoes, stirrups, and cartridges. Using historical records and mapping the position where each artifact was found, the soldiers' formation gradually became clear. Custer's 220 men spread out over 2 kilometers. They staged from 3 locations on the ridge, now known as Calhoun Hill, Custer Hill, and the Keogh sector. To the archaeologists, this seemed an offensive formation. But where did Custer's confidence come from? He'd seen only a small number of warriors and believed that Major Reno was holding firm. Custer had also ordered Captain Benteen to return with reinforcements. He assumed help was on the way. What Custer couldn't know was that Indian warriors fought back from Reno's attack, driving him up a steep bluff many kilometers away. Benteen went to Reno's aid, leaving Custer on his own. With Benteen and Reno's troops in retreat, the warriors turned their attention to Custer. As the afternoon of June the 25th progressed, more warriors approached Custer's men. Coming from the south, they surrounded Custer and his men at Calhoun Hill. There, in the late afternoon, the first major fighting erupted. Over a century later, archaeologists have pieced together the battle.
On Calhoun Hill, we found something like that, which is represented here. The flags marking where cartridge cases were found, each from a different soldier. Now, the linear distribution provides us with a really good clue of what's going on. This is a skirmish line.
A skirmish line is a standard cavalry formation with soldiers positioned 4.5 meters apart. The warriors fired. Custer's men shot back without panic. Below the Calhoun skirmish line, the archaeologists discovered a major warrior position.
This area was called Greasy Grass Ridge. It was here that many 44 and 50 caliber cartridge cases that were used by the Indians were found. And it was here the Indian warriors could pop up and fire at Calhoun soldiers, and then they'd come back down to be out of the line of fire. And literally this whole ridge was covered with cartridge cases.
They began to get closer and closer to the soldiers on the ridge. They darted from sagebrush to sagebrush, from fold to fold. Eventually, warriors throughout this area got very, very close to the soldiers' position.
One company was sent to drive the Indians back. But the warriors launched a devastating countercharge. Custer's attack had failed. Emboldened, the warriors pressed their attack. Panic and fear spread amongst Custer's men on the skirmish line.
Nearby the skirmish lines, we found cartridge cases clustered together. Soldiers became fearful and they abandoned the skirmish line and began to bunch together.
The command and control was lost, and the herding instinct took place, and they bunched up, which is not what you do in combat if you want to maintain control and keep a good steady fire.
The soldiers' defense disintegrated. Armed with superior close-range firepower, the warriors overran Calhoun Hill. Custer's first position fell. Through artifacts, archaeologists continued to track the battle. Using forensic techniques, they established how some of the soldiers died.
This is the right hip bone. It has a gunshot wound that came in from the person's right and back side, entered the bone, and perforated right on through and kept on going.
This skull contained a particularly unusual wound. It may be that a warrior fired a small bullet in a larger caliber rifle, creating a wobbly projectile.
Bullet came in here, fractures radiated from the bullet hole, and the rectangular hole indicates that the bullet was probably tumbling when it hit the skull. Nevertheless, even if it was tumbling, it still had enough power to go through the brain and come out the other side.
Evidence suggests the struggle was fierce and that the warriors made sure there were no survivors.
You get the impression the guy was down and a gunshot came in middle of the back of the head, kind of execution style.
Archaeologists now had a clearer picture of what happened on that fateful day.
After a gun is fired, the cartridge case is ejected. The combatant moves to another position, reloads, and the process is repeated. So you can see that we can trace the path of someone across the battlefield if the firing pin marks on the base of the cartridge case match.
The battlefield detectives painstakingly examined the firing pin impressions of each shell. The large marks indicated the model. There were also microscopic marks. Each gun had its own ballistic fingerprint. Matching the marks and mapping the locations where they were found, the precise movements of soldiers who fought at the last stand became clear to the archaeologists. The scientists could gauge what transpired at Calhoun Hill. A few lucky soldiers survived and fled to the Keogh sector.
We have the soldiers' pathways represented. One soldier at Calhoun Hill firing a couple of shots and heading toward the Keogh sector, and another soldier firing a couple of shots and also moving into the Keogh sector.
However, the soldiers had not eluded their enemy.
The lines over here indicate the movement of an Indian from Greasy Grass Ridge to Calhoun and into Keogh, and another warrior moving up toward the Calhoun, up past Keogh, and then down over here.
Like Calhoun Hill, Keogh offered little protection. The battle was a rout. In less than 30 minutes, 2 positions fell. The only one left was Kastër Hill. Dispelling myth after myth, the scientists focused on a critical question. Did Custer's soldiers actually fight a protracted and organized battle? Or is the last stand an unfounded legend? By the evening of June the 25th, half of Custer's men were dead. The last 100 or so soldiers clustered on a small ridge. The Indians surrounded them below.
They used the cover of the sagebrush, the hillocks, the ravines, all over this battlefield beautifully. As more men were down, the warriors were able to take advantage of the lessening firepower of the soldiers and get closer and closer.
Faced with this final assault, did Custer's men fight valiantly, or were they quickly overrun? The archaeologists analysed the cartridges found on Custer Hill.
Well, here on Custer Hill, we didn't find much in the way of government cartridge cases. A handful of Colt cases and a handful of carbine cases. But more importantly, there's no patterning in it, indicating that there was no tactical organization here, or very little.
There were no large quantities of spent cartridges, which therefore suggests there was no long battle. No patterns indicating organized formations. No heroic last stand.
These soldiers were brave, but as so often happens, psychological debilitation plays a role. Panic and fear spread. We're dealing pretty much with chaos in a desperate situation.
The soldiers must have felt pure terror as the warriors fired on them repeatedly. Within minutes, most soldiers on the hill lay dead or wounded. The warriors rushed in for the final kill. Unlike the legend of the last stand, the fight on Custer Hill must have been quick work. Fox found confirmation in the accounts of Indian eyewitnesses.
One Indian account tells us that it was just a few minutes. Another, no longer than it takes a hungry man to eat his dinner.
At the top of the hill lies America's most famous fighter of the Indians, George Armstrong Custer. Today, marble memorials dot the Little Bighorn battlefield. They are a reminder of Custer's tragedy. But they may also be one last clue to what happened here. These memorials were placed where the soldiers' bodies were originally found. According to legend, the final skirmish took place on Custer Hill. But there is a line of memorials trailing down from Custer Hill to a deep ravine. Confirmed by warrior testimony, researchers now believe that as Custer Hill first came under attack, some 40 soldiers fled to create a diversion. Warriors chased many into the ravine, where they finally finished off the last of the soldiers.
So not only was there not an heroic last stand in the legendary sense on Custer Hill, the last fighting didn't even take place there. It took place in the ravine behind me.
The archaeologists excavated the ravine searching for the last victims. Beside one stone, they discovered an important artifact. It was a pearl button, probably worn by one of Custer's Indian scouts. They also found a skull fragment with an unusually wide cheekbone.
When the analytical work was done by the physical anthropologist, we determined the individual here was a racially admixed individual, meaning a Native American and white ancestry. The only person to fit that criteria was Mitch Boyer, Custer's scout, who was a mixed Sioux and French fur trader ancestry.
The forensic scientists superimposed the skull fragment over the only known photograph of Bouyer. It matched. Bouyer's supposed prophecy that neither he nor Custer would live apparently is true. Amongst the memorials, where most markers are nameless, science has ensured that Bouyer's is not. More than a century after the infamous battle at Little Bighorn, archaeologists searched to uncover the truth about Custer's last stand. In a ravine, where the last moments of the battle occurred, they made an intriguing find.
The archaeological evidence of the fighting here at this particular marker is interesting. A few cartridge cases fired by the soldier, and around him are evidence of at least 6, possibly 8 Indians firing at this individual. The luxury of having time to turn 8 or 6 guns on an individual to fire may suggest this was one of the last people to die.
On the 27th of June, 2 days after Custer's defeat, the victors left. Major Reno and Captain Bentine's troops, who had been 6.5 kilometers away, unable to come to Custer's aid, came down from their steep bluffs and stumbled on the nightmare of the defeat.
The survivors of Custer's regiment described it as a scene of sickening, ghastly horror. And it was certainly what it was. These bodies mutilated beyond recognition.
Soldiers found Custer's naked body at the top of Custer Hill, lying close to 5 of his officers.
He was not scalped. There was at least 1 bullet wound, gunshot wound to the chest, left breast, a gunshot wound to the left temple, and he may have had a thigh slashed or an arrow in the genital area.
There are no photographs from the Battle of Little Bighorn, but an image of a cavalryman killed by the Cheyenne several years earlier reveals the harsh treatment the soldiers received. These little-seen eyewitness drawings made by the warriors who defeated Custer vividly show the battlefield mutilation.
The reason that the Native Americans said that they mutilated the bodies was so that people, when they entered the next life, the afterlife, they would enter that life without fingers, without legs, without eyes. If you had an enemy in this life, you'd tend to have that same enemy in the next life. If he lacks a trigger finger, he's not going to be able to shoot you.
Willie's forensic work documented extensive mutilation. It is a chilling conclusion to the last stand. The end for Custer and his men may have been even more horrible than ever imagined. Adopting the methods and skills of detectives, archaeologists have been able to shatter one of the greatest myths of the American West. Their discoveries have changed the perception about Custer's men. Many were not elite soldiers, but young and inexperienced. Artifacts have provided more understanding of the warriors. Far from primitive fighters, they carried technologically advanced weapons and used the terrain to their advantage. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, it was not a last stand, but a short, devastating rout. And yet, this newfound knowledge will not change the enduring image of George Armstrong Custer.
Custer's last stand, Custer's last rally. He's always going to be 36 years old, always dressed in those buckskins, always standing defiant on that western hillside. The perfect example of defiance, American defiance, in the face of insurmountable odds.